The mahogany walls of my father's study felt suffocating as I stood there, watching Victoria wave his will like a victory flag. Her perfectly manicured nails, blood red against the crisp legal paper, made my stomach turn. "I just don't understand why you're not more upset, Charlotte," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Finding out you've been disinherited must be quite a shock. My name is Charlotte Reid, and I was standing in what used to be my childhood home, facing the woman who had spent the last 5 years systematically destroying my relationship with my father. Now, barely 2 weeks after his funeral, she was revealing her true colors. "It's fine, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You can have it all." She faltered slightly, clearly thrown by my calm acceptance. The Victoria I knew expected tears, protests, maybe even begging. Instead, I was standing there, completely composed, which seemed to irritate her more than any emotional outburst would have. "Well," she sniffed, carefully refolding the will, "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Your father made his choice, after all. He clearly knew who deserved his legacy." I thought about the night before Dad died, about what I found in his old safe hidden behind the portrait of my mother. Victoria had no idea that Dad had called me to his study that evening, his voice weak but urgent over the phone. "Come quickly, Charlie," he'd said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "There's something you need to know." I'd rushed over, finding him in his leather chair, looking frailer than I'd ever seen him. The cancer had ravaged him in the final months, but there was a fierce determination in his eyes that night. "The combination," he'd whispered, pointing weakly at Mom's portrait. "It's your birthday. The old safe, behind." He'd started coughing then, and I'd reached for his water glass, but he waved me away. "No time. Look inside. You'll understand everything." Those were the last coherent words he spoke to me. By morning he was gone. Victoria had appeared almost immediately, taking charge of the funeral arrangements, playing the grieving widow to perfection. She even managed to cry at exactly the right moments during the service, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Now, standing in his study, I watched as she moved behind his desk, running her hand possessively over the leather chair. "I'll be making some changes, of course," she said. "This room is so dated. All this dark wood, these old books, it's rather depressing, don't you think?" I thought about the contents of the safe, carefully hidden in my apartment. "Do whatever you like," I said. "It's your house now." She sat in Dad's chair, and something flickered across her face. Triumph, maybe, or satisfaction. "You know, Charlotte, I never understood why your father kept this portrait of your mother. Rather morbid, don't you think? Hanging your dead wife's picture in your study all these years." My hands clenched involuntarily, but I kept my expression neutral. Mom's portrait had been there for as long as I could remember. Dad had commissioned it just before she got sick, capturing her exactly as I remembered her. Warm brown eyes, gentle smile, radiating kindness. She died when I was 8, leaving Dad to raise me alone. Victoria had entered our lives 15 years later, when I was 23 and fresh out of college. She'd seemed different then, or maybe she'd just been better at hiding her true nature. Dad had fallen hard and fast, and within 6 months, they were married. Looking at her now, perfectly coiffed and coolly triumphant, it was hard to believe I'd ever trusted her. "I was thinking of having it removed," she continued, watching my face carefully. "Perhaps donated to charity. So thoughtful of me, don't you think? Helping others while clearing out old memories." "The portrait isn't included in the will," I said quietly. "It belonged to my mother's family. It goes to me." For a moment, anger flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a sympathetic smile. "Oh, darling, I'm afraid that's not correct. Everything in this house was listed in the estate inventory, including all artwork." I pulled out my phone and opened a photo I'd taken years ago. The original bill of sale for the portrait, clearly showing it had been purchased by my maternal grandfather. "I have the documentation," I said. "Unless you want to involve the lawyers?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Keep the dreary thing. It's not worth arguing about." If she only knew what that portrait had hidden all these years. The safe behind it had contained more than just documents. It had held the truth about Victoria, about the company, about everything. Dad had started Reid Technologies from nothing, building it into one of the most successful software development companies in the state. Victoria had been a junior accountant when they met, quickly working her way up to CFO after their marriage. I'd worked there too, in the marketing department, until mysterious complaints about my performance started surfacing. Your father's worried about your commitment to the company, Victoria had told me during one of our weekly lunches, her voice heavy with concern. Perhaps you'd be happier somewhere else? Somewhere with less pressure. I'd resigned the next day, unwilling to cause Dad any more stress. Now I wondered how many of those complaints had actually come from him. Well, Victoria said, standing up and smoothing her designer skirt, if that's all settled, I do have a board meeting to prepare for. The transition of leadership needs to be handled delicately, you understand. I nodded, already turning to leave. Good luck with everything, Victoria. Oh, and Charlotte, she called after me. Don't forget to return your key. You won't be needing it anymore. I placed the key on a side table without a word and walked out of what used to be my home. My car was parked at the end of the long driveway, and as I slid behind the wheel, I finally allowed myself to smile. In my apartment, spread across my dining room table, were the contents of Dad's safe, documents, USB drives, and a letter addressed to me in his shaking handwriting. I'd spent the night after his death going through everything, each revelation more shocking than the last. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized from one of the documents. Agent Morrison. This is Charlotte Reid. I have something you're going to want to see. The federal office building was imposing, all glass and steel rising into the clouds. Agent Sarah Morrison met me in the lobby, her handshake firm and professional. Thank you for coming in, Ms. Reid, she said, leading me through security. We've been investigating Reid Technologies for months, but we haven't been able to get enough evidence to move forward. In a conference room upstairs, I carefully laid out everything I found in the safe. Financial records showing systematic fraud. Emails between Victoria and offshore accounts. Evidence of money laundering on a massive scale. Your father knew? Agent Morrison asked, examining a particularly damning document. I nodded, pulling out Dad's letter. He found out about 6 months ago, when the cancer was already bad. He started gathering evidence, but he was too weak to do anything about it. That's why he called me that last night. And you're sure about this? Once we move forward, there's no going back. I thought about Victoria sitting in Dad's chair, so smug in her victory, about the years of manipulation and lies, about Dad spending his final months trying to expose the truth. I'm sure, I said firmly, Victoria thinks she's won everything. I want her to understand exactly what that means. Agent Morrison nodded, gathering the documents. We'll need a few days to verify everything and get the warrants in order. In the meantime, don't do anything to tip her off. But Victoria was already celebrating her triumph. That evening, my phone buzzed with notifications from multiple social media platforms. She posted photos of herself in Dad's study, announcing her new role as CEO of Reid Technologies. Carrying on my beloved husband's legacy, the caption read, Edward would be so proud to see his vision continue. I thought about the real vision I found documented in the safe. Dad's plans to expose the fraud, to make things right. He'd run out of time, but he'd made sure I had everything I needed to finish what he'd started. The next few days were a blur of meetings with federal agents, lawyers, and forensic accountants. Each piece of evidence was carefully verified, each transaction traced to its source. Victoria's web of fraud was impressive in its complexity, but Dad had been thorough in documenting every detail. She's good, one of the forensic accountants admitted, reviewing the records. If your father hadn't caught her, this might have gone on for years. I watched as they built their case, thinking about all the signs I'd missed over the years. The subtle ways Victoria had isolated Dad from his friends and family, the gradual takeover of the company's financial operations, the convenient explanations for every questionable decision. Don't be too hard on yourself, Agent Morrison said, seeming to read my thoughts. She's done this before. That had been one of the most shocking discoveries in Dad's safe. Evidence that Victoria had pulled similar cons at least twice before, using different names and identities. She'd refined her technique each time, learning from past mistakes. The thing is, Agent Morrison continued, she's never had to deal with someone like your father, someone who saw through her and managed to gather this much evidence. Or someone like me, I thought, who was willing to let her believe she'd won in order to bring her down. A week after my meeting with Agent Morrison, I sat in my car across from Reid Technologies, watching Victoria arrive for what she didn't know would be her last day as CEO. She stepped out of her Mercedes wearing one of her signature power suits, not a hair out of place, radiating the same confidence that had fooled everyone for so long. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morrison. Teams in position. Stay clear until we give the signal. I'd argued to be present for Victoria's arrest, but the FBI had insisted on handling things their way. Still, they couldn't stop me from watching from a distance. I owed myself and Dad that much. The morning proceeded normally. Employees streamed into the building, coffee cups in hand, unaware that their worlds were about to shift dramatically. Around 10, I noticed increased activity. Unmarked vehicles pulling up, men and women in suits entering through different entrances. Then, at exactly 10:47 a.m., my phone lit up again. Now. I walked into the building I'd once called my second home, flashing my old ID badge. The security guard, Tom, who'd known me since I was a kid, gave me a knowing nod. They'd briefed key personnel earlier that morning. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, I heard Victoria's voice carrying down the hallway, sharp with anger. "This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea who I am?" I rounded the corner to find the boardroom in chaos. Federal agents were seizing computers and documents while Victoria stood surrounded by several FBI agents, her face flushed with rage. Her perfect composure had finally cracked. She spotted me and her eyes narrowed. "You," she hissed. "What did you do?" "Me?" I said, stepping closer. "I just followed Dad's last wishes. He wanted the truth to come out, Victoria. All of it." "Truth?" She laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it. "What truth?" Edward was delusional at the end. "The cancer medications." "Save it." Agent Morrison cut in, producing a warrant. "We have everything. The offshore accounts, the money laundering, your previous identities. Jennifer Hayes in Seattle, Maria Porter in Chicago. Should I continue?" The color drained from Victoria's face. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "You know what your mistake was?" I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "You thought Dad was too weak to fight back, but he spent his last months gathering evidence, documenting everything. The safe behind Mom's portrait, it wasn't just a sentimental hiding place. It was his insurance policy." "The safe," Victoria whispered, realization dawning. "That night he called you. He gave me the combination. Everything I needed was right there, including proof that you manipulated his medications during his final weeks, keeping him just confused enough to sign whatever you put in front of him." Agent Morrison stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "Victoria Reid, you're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As they led her away, Victoria turned back to me one last time. "He never loved you, you know. Not like he loved me. I gave him everything he wanted." I shook my head, feeling pity despite everything. "No, Victoria, you gave him what you wanted him to want. There's a difference." The next few hours were intense. The FBI conducted interviews, seized records, and began the complex process of untangling Victoria's web of financial fraud. The board was assembled for an emergency meeting where the full scope of her crimes was revealed. "The company's finances will need to be completely audited," Agent Morrison explained to the shell-shocked board members. "But Ms. Reid has provided us with detailed documentation that should help expedite the process." One of the older board members, James Wilson, who'd worked with Dad since the beginning, turned to me. "Charlotte, your father always said you had his instincts. Would you consider taking a more active role during this transition?" I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove myself, about the way Victoria had pushed me out. "I'd be honored," I said. "But first, there's something else that needs to be addressed." I pulled out another document from Dad's safe, his real will, dated just 3 days before his death, properly witnessed and notarized. Victoria's version was a forgery. "This is my father's true last testament." The differences were stark. While Victoria's version had left everything to her, Dad's real will was more thoughtful. The company's shares were divided between me and a trust for the employees. The house was to be sold, with proceeds going to cancer research. And there was a personal message. "To my daughter Charlotte, I'm sorry I didn't see through Victoria's manipulation sooner. You were right about her, and I was too proud to admit it. Everything I've gathered is in your hands now. Make it right." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, corporate restructuring, and media attention. Victoria's arrest made headlines, especially when her previous identities and crimes came to light. She'd been running variations of the same con for years, marrying wealthy men, manipulating them, and eventually taking control of their assets. But Dad had been different. He caught on to her scheme, and in his final months, he orchestrated her downfall with a precision that would have made any CEO proud. 3 months after Victoria's arrest, I sat in Dad's old office, my office now, looking at Mom's portrait. We'd moved it from the house before the sale, and it felt right having her watch over the company's new chapter. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Agent Morrison, holding a thick file. "Final report," she said, placing it on my desk. "Victoria took a plea deal, 20 years plus full restitution. She's also provided information about other potential victims." "Thank you," I said, running my fingers over the file. "For everything." She smiled. "Your father would be proud, you know. Not many people would have handled this the way you did, staying calm, playing the long game." I glanced at Mom's portrait, then at the modern art piece now hanging where the safe used to be. "I learned from the best. Dad always said patience was the key to success." "Speaking of success," Agent Morrison said, "I hear Reid Technologies is doing well under new leadership." I nodded, unable to suppress a small smile. The company had not just survived the scandal, it was thriving. We'd implemented new transparency measures, strengthened our ethical guidelines, and launched a foundation to help victims of financial fraud. "We're building something better," I said. "Something real." After Agent Morrison left, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out Dad's letter, the one I'd found in the safe that last night. I'd read it so many times the paper was starting to wear at the creases, but today it felt different. "My dearest Charlie," it began, "if you're reading this, then I've run out of time. But I'm not leaving you defenseless. Everything you need to expose Victoria's crimes is here. Use it wisely. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about building something stronger from the ashes of what they tried to destroy." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the drawer. Outside my office window, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Somewhere in a federal prison, Victoria was learning the true cost of her victory. But here, in the company my father built and entrusted to me, his real legacy was just beginning. The next morning, I arrived early to find James Wilson waiting in the lobby. "Have you seen this?" he asked, holding up the morning paper. The headline read, "Reid Technologies launches revolutionary new security platform." I smiled. The platform had been Dad's last project, something Victoria had dismissed as a waste of resources. Now it was poised to revolutionize corporate security, potentially preventing others from falling victim to schemes like hers. "He knew what he was doing," I said quietly, "right until the end." James squeezed my shoulder. "He certainly did, when he chose you to carry on his work." As I walked to my office, employees nodded and smiled. They'd all stayed through the crisis, many of them sharing stories about how Dad had helped them over the years. Those stories had sustained me during the darkest days after his death. I paused at my office door, looking at the new nameplate, Charlotte Reid, Chief Executive Officer. Below it, we added Dad's favorite quote, "Integrity is the best inheritance." Victoria had thought she was claiming a fortune. Instead, she'd lost everything trying to steal what Dad had freely given me all along. Not just wealth or position, but the values that made them worthwhile. I touched Mom's portrait gently before sitting down at my desk. There was work to be done, a legacy to honor, and a future to build. And somewhere, I knew Dad was smiling.